Yeah.
What? Shake and bake.
Tamiya announcing anything usually gets the juices flowing, and when they recently announced the Pak38 with crew was inbound, it was only a matter of time before it would be hitting the workbench. So today I'll take a look at the kit for you, but I'll also take a deep dive into painting and weathering the gun, the figures, as well as creating a small landscape base for it, so you can follow along and create a cool little early war scene just for yourself. The great thing about Tamiya is, generally speaking, you know what you're going to get, and it's usually a pretty affordable price point, and this kit seems to follow that mould. The kit offers you the option to build the gun in the fixed or the towed position, and construction begins with the framework, soon followed by the gun cradle. Read the instructions carefully though, because the build order and the positions for the sight and aiming mechanism are somewhat vague, especially given it's a Tamiya kit. I also found the setting points and positions for the toolboxes to be oddly clumsy. Maybe Tamiya has spoilt us in the past, and to be fair, the criticism is probably a stretch. But you can usually work out on autopilot these kits, but this one's just a little bit different. The feeling is reinforced with the positioning of the braces for that gun shield. When in place, they are absolutely perfect, but getting them there and getting them in place takes a degree of concentration and focus. The axle assembly allows for movement in that gun position, and the barrel could soon be sanded and slid in place over the cradle. The Pak38 used a double layer spaced gun shield comprising of two relatively thin spaced steel plates rather than one big thick single one. It was thought that this would give the best balance between protection and weight as well as mobility. The idea being that front plate would take any impact of enemy fire, and the inner plate would hopefully protect the crew. The arms can now be connected with a pin, and they remain operational, and the wheels, which are a simple sandwich style of construction, can be installed. A polycap in the centre of those wheels ensures that they can be removed for painting in the future steps. The kit comes with a number of active as well as spent shell casings. The used casings can be improved with a micro drill to open up that cavity, although I didn't end up using these spent ones in the end. The shells were then prepared for paint, and the brass colour was achieved with a 50-50 mix of a brass and an aluminium. I find the aluminium just brightens things up and presents the shells better than the brass does alone. The projectile can then be brush painted and set aside. The gun was first prepared with a layer of primer, and I'm using VMS black here and taking care to ensure it finds its way into all those deep recesses and crevices. I like to paint my German grey lighter than you may expect, and I find that dark sea grey over that black primer gives me the colour I'm just about looking for. I usually start on an inconspicuous spot like the back of a wheel hub, say, just to ensure I'm happy with the thinning ratios and the colour before I commit it to the main elements of the model. The Pak38 is a bitsy and detailed model, with the only surface area of any great significance being the gun shield, so I pay close attention to creating that mottled coverage in that area, especially letting that primer influence that grey colour. By then adding a couple of drops of white grey and a drop of ivory, I create my highlights. Now that ivory should help that lighter grey tone keep a degree of richness to the colour. I focus that application over the horizontal surfaces like the top side of the barrel and the top edges of the curves of that shield. This helps create volume over those small surface areas. And a couple more drops of white grey applied over an even smaller surface area helps extend that effect. Weathering will tone this down, so be brave with your highlights because you have far greater latitude with this technique than you might think. A mix of basalt grey and black can then be added and mixed to taste, and brush painted around the wheels to represent the rubber of those road wheels. Keeping that acrylic paint wet and nicely thin with an acrylic thinner makes short work of a job like this. Details around the model can also be painted at this stage. The spade in a Gen 3 light wood colour and the head of the spade in graphite. It always amazes me how painting the tools gives the model an immediate lift. Grim brown is then applied with a sponge to create chipping around the top edges of the shield and around details like the toolboxes. By removing most of the paint off the sponge and then gently dabbing it against the model, this effect is built up and created. It should be subtle and just about adding tone and texture to the finish. That effect is then enhanced by using that graphite colour again and applying it in a similar fashion. Now I'm using it here to create some superficial chips and scuffs, and I'm using it to also tone down the dark brown chipping I added previously. It's just another layer that I'm adding to the mix. Dry brushing isn't something I do very often, but with graphite in the palette, I loaded that flat brush and then proceeded to remove as much paint off it as I possibly could. I could then move the brush over the parts, allowing a small amount of the paint that was left on it to catch the raised edges and details. Now you can see the subtle effect that technique has and can really give your model a degree of visual pop. A black enamel wash, thanks to Tamiya panel liner, is applied. Now that black works beautifully over the grey tones as it keeps a degree of coolness to it, whereas browns could add too much warmth and grime, and it's something that I'm trying to avoid. The thing with Tamiya panel liner is it grabs more aggressively than other enamel washes and has to be reactivated with a white spirit in order to tidy it up. I use this to my advantage though and use a sawtooth brush lightly moistened in the white spirit and move it in that downward motion over the detail. Not only does that refine the wash, it creates subtle streaking which gives the impression of wear and age. Truth be known, I've probably got a bit of streaking myself. Anyway, another handy technique to sharpen the lines of that wash is to use a tip of a cotton bud and the white spirit again. If the cotton bud gets a bit too fluffy, then just get rid of it and get a fresh one, otherwise it will leave fibres over your model. To finish the gun off, a light dusting of Tamiya buff is applied to the lower edges of the armour and the wheels. It's a simple but effective way to apply your weathering. Moving on to the figures, and there is no doubt Tamiya are really setting the standard for injection moulded figures in the hobby world. The way the pieces join and integrate with the seams and folds in the fabric is so impressive and never ceases to amaze me just how far this technology has come. Once the basic assemblies had been completed, a small wire was glued into their feet and they could be placed into a cork and primed in a VMS grey. The primer highlighted a few small gaps that would require filling, and that was done with a smear of perfect plastic putty, which is very handy stuff to have on the shelf. To paint the figures, I'm using the AK Gen 3 acrylics along with the Quick Gen paints from their line. One of the light bulb moments for me with figure painting came through Calvin Tan, and using a dedicated acrylic thinner to thin your paint and using that matte varnish to create glazes for your transitions. The other handy tool here is the wet palette that you can see on the screen, and if you're serious about figure painting, you should be looking at getting one without a doubt. I generally use a size 2 brush and a 20/0 for detail work. Now I know I've been promising a dedicated figure painting tutorial, and I promise that is still on my to-do list, but for now I'll try and move reasonably quickly through this process. The shades and contours of the flesh elements are first mapped out using a mix of Quick Gen paints, crimson and human flesh. Now they are well thinned with the acrylic thinner. That thinner allows the paint to give a more even coverage over the surface area. However, the darkest elements in that pigment will tend to settle in the shadowed and the deepest recesses of that sculpt and bring that face to life. This would be repeated, however, while that first layer was drying, I looked to block in the colours of the uniform. I'm using the paint set from the Wehrmacht uniforms and paint the trousers in the field grey, and that comes with a grey bias, and for the tunic, the field grey with the green bias. Now that variation makes the figure a little more interesting to my eye. The second round of washes is applied to the face. You can see the way the paint settled in the recesses, giving that life to the sculpt. Now, if you're a beginner here and painting faces feels intimidating, do just this step and lightly dry brush a flesh tone over the face, and you'll be amazed at the outcome. However, I'm going to complicate things and generate my flesh tones with a light flesh, a skin tone, and an ivory. Now I try to create 5 to 6 graduating colours using those 3 basic colours. This is done in a wet palette, and now that wet palette is designed to keep moisture in the system, giving you a greater working window with that acrylic paint. The various shades are applied then using the wash as a roadmap to tell me where the high and low points are in the sculpt. Now I lean into that and I work with what the paints are telling me. The lighter the tone, the less the coverage is the general rule, and by using that matte varnish to extend the paint, I can create smoother transitions through those graduations. I hope that's all making sense. Moving back and forth through the shades and keeping the paint extended with that varnish and thinned with that acrylic thinner allows for the shades to blend and flow seamlessly. At least that is the aim. The same principle is used for the uniforms and for the pants. My shades are created using the grey base as the darkest colour, a grey blue as the mid, and a skin tone to brighten up the shade. Again, using the skin tone should prevent that colour from desaturating and keep some body to it. Use logic and think about what parts of the fabric would catch the light and focus your highlighting on them. For the tunic, my shades are created using that field grey with the green bias, with a grey green as the mid-tone and an ivory for my highlights, and mixing blends of those. The techniques are all the same, and using that varnish and thinner, I know I'm going on about it, has really become a game changer for me and has brought a lot of joy back into figure painting. It's a shame it's so time consuming because it's something I would love to do more of. To paint the collar and the shoulder boards, I first paint them in a white grey and then let them dry and apply the black to define the detail over that part. It's so much easier than trying to paint a fine white line around an undulating sculpt. The buttons can be painted silver. One thing I did notice was a lack of the Reichsadler or the eagle badge on the uniforms on the right hand breast. Plus the figures didn't have any helmet straps, which is quite unusual. But back to the uniforms, and this is where the quick gen paints really come into their own, and they will bring depth and unify the shades that I've created. The German grey is applied through the folds and recesses of the pants and used as a glaze to unify the colours. And the same technique is used to unify the tunic, only this time I'm using field grey, again in that quick gen line. This is more than a pin wash, it's more like a targeted glaze and wash all at the same time. I'll call it a gouache, I like the sound of that. A matte varnish to seal everything in, and these figures were good to go. I'd been playing around with ideas for the scene and found my way back to the round style of base. I like the shape because it invites the viewer to investigate around the scene, plus that round format fits better in my display case. A small embankment is created using polystyrene and loosely trimmed to shape with a hot wire foam cutter. Sculpt-A-Mold is a pre-mixed paper mache style of product, and with just a touch of water instantly gives you the easiest product to smooth and sculpt terrain with. It dries quite quickly, and when it starts to go off, I can smooth the surface over with the tips of my fingers. Given 24 hours to fully set, I can then wrap the base in a styrene sheet to dress it. The styrene has a matte black vinyl on the face, and on the back of it has a 3M mounting film which allows it to adhere to that foam. The sharp blade can then be used to trim the excess following the lay of the land. With the basic topography in place, I use an AK acrylic terrains paste to create my groundwork. I first apply dry earth with a palette knife over the section of that scene, and that will represent the dirt road, and then with a dark mud colour, set about creating the areas at the side of the road and on the hill. I could have just used one colour here and established the zones with paintwork later, but I have these two tones in the stash and it helps me define the scene and get it a little clearer in my mind. Because the paste is an acrylic, I am able to soften and blend the two colours with a wet brush, so the definition between the two colours isn't so stark. And while the paste is still wet, I'm able to sprinkle various grades of soil and gravel over that terrain. The terrains paste has a texture of its own, which presents when it's dry. However, adding variation to the paste is a good idea and helps present that groundwork in a more realistic way. The sand and pebbles are helped then settle into the paste, again with the help of a soft brush. Crunched up dried herbs is mixed in with static grass and general scatter and sprinkled over the hill, and a fine sand from VMS applied over the groundwork. Building these textures and natural variation in the groundwork is an ever-evolving process and can often present very differently after it dries. The debris and the sand can then be soaked in a sand and ballast freeze and left to dry and settle in place. Once dry, the elements are all helped blend, first with a targeted application of Tamiya flat earth, and then highlights were created using buff. However, that footage seems to have gone missing, I'm sorry. Adding vegetation and other organic elements to a base is where the magic starts to really happen, as it softens everything and brings life to barren ground. I first map out where I want my grass to sit with a diluted mix of PVA glue, and then using a static grass applicator, dust the fibres over the area. The applicator has a charge that allows those grass fibres to stand on end and present like blades of grass. It's a really handy tool for this type of thing. Static grass tends to work really well when you apply multiple layers, as well as mixing in different lengths and colours during this application. Foraging in the garden is a great place to find handy elements for your bases as well, and here I'm using offcuts from a root ball off the bottom of a weed I found. Such a simple thing to do, and adding them in the side of that hill brings another element and a sense of nature to the scene. I'd added the tree to the scene as well, as you may notice, and that was as easy as pulling it out of the packaging. These ready to go trees from AK are pretty spectacular and really make it easy to make a big impact with a minimum of effort. Again, from the garden, and a branch from a tree makes for a nice addition and something for the gun crew to hide themselves behind. A few additional grabs of grass and debris could be held in place with a diluted mix of white glue, and I was on the home straight. Further contrast is added to the groundwork with dark brown and earth enamel wash colours. Applying this diluted wash with white spirit will help give those organic fibres and rocks and stones some character and definition. Again, this is the classic example of it looking different when it's wet than it will when it dries, so it's a matter of trusting the process. The gun and the figures are then glued in place, and to help give the scene a little more of a story, I 3D printed a couple of rabbits and placed one of them under the log and another one on the back of the hill. Let's see if you can find her. And with that, this diorama, which has a name now, Hunting, was complete. Essentially, this was a review of the Tamiya Pak38 and the crew, so given that was the case, I wanted to present the model as it comes out of the box and push it as far as I could go. No aftermarket heads or hands, no modification, just a little diorama out of the box. I think the thing that I like so much about these small box releases by Tamiya is that they give you a diorama in a box, and without too much effort you can end up with a beautiful display that you can be proud of. Think about the machine gun crew they released, or the sidecar, or that Goliath boxing they released. They are also usable and interesting. It's hard not to get inspired by them. This kit is a really lovely version of this gun and makes into a delicate display piece. However, you need to keep your wits about you because this is anything but the traditional Tamiya shake and bake style of kit. Fine integrated assemblies and instructions that are a touch confusing at times demand you to take your time and double check your fit before committing to glue. It's not that it's hard, it's just not typical Tamiya in terms of the ease of the build. The figures are absolutely beautiful as mentioned though, and the engineering and fit is extraordinary, and the pose and balance is incredibly lifelike. The facial expressions are really good, especially old Eagle Eye. However, not all good news with the missing badges and chin straps. Some of the sculpts on the hands are also a little dodgy, but they are generally the hands obscured by other things like a shell or an ammunition case, say. When all is said and done, this kit is something every armour modeler should have in their stash, as it is an important piece of German military history and was the stepping stone to some of their heavier hitters. Now, a shameless plug for my Patreon page who's helped me along with this one. The content I'm posting there is like a magazine subscription, only better, because you get to ask me questions as you're reading through it. Dialing into that community is a great way to improve your own modelling and connect with like-minded people. Plus, you'll get to see what I'm working on now, and I think you'll be completely surprised. What a great time to be in this hobby, especially with the new stuff Tamiya has just announced, and I can't wait to get my hands on those. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
That's the White Rabbit.